You're up first. Okay.
Is that a clicker?
Oh, sure.
Are we supposed to be doing
do it manually.
Oh, that's our thing. I'm gonna sit.
Kristen,
Oh, she.
you're good.
No, but yeah, but okay.
So you're first, right?
Okay.
He's back. What do you do after a delicious lunch like that, but follow up, well, you applaud the lunch, but you follow up with 3 researchers? I think that's definitely
We're
what you do.
activists. No.
One of the really wonderful things about the National Collaboration for Youth, and I'm a little embarrassed we didn't really mean to be doing such a commercial, but is that we not only have practitioners, I think we started out with people who were from youth-serving agencies when the Collab was created about 40-some years ago. But in recent years, we've also had at the table the think tanks, the action tanks, the thought leaders of the sector. And this panel is of people who represent that. And they're the people I look to. And it strikes me as we talk, and we heard the presentation earlier from Astra and from Mandy, that maybe we listen to different researchers based on, what discipline that we're in, and that maybe one of the takeaways today is that we need to be listening to each other's researchers and across disciplines and that kind of thing. I also feel compelled to point out that we're, aside from streaming this audience is really state of the art. We have 2 interesting mobile apps represented, and maybe more. We've got Bill Carney here. Bill will wave his hand. He has a positive youth development mobile app on your hip. All the information that you need to work with kids in out-of-school time programs. Not all, but a lot. And then we also have Susan Jones, who has a college visit apps. Susan, are you in the room? She just left. Anyway, I just thought that was so interesting, talking about applications of technology. This is a great panel. We're starting out a little bit behind time, but I know that you're going to find a lot of complementarity in the presentations. One of the things that's really striking about this field of positive youth development is that there is such a solid base in research, and it is, there's so much common belief, common precepts, common concepts across the organizations. And in this panel today, we're going to talk about some of the commonalities of our framework or frameworks, the whole child frames, the ecological concept, kid in the context of community, not kid at school. One thing, kid at home, another thing, it's all fits together. We're going to talk about the developmental assets, and I think most of you know, how many of you are aware of the 40 developmental assets? About half. The rest of you will be by the time you leave today. And then we're going to talk about how positive youth development is operationalized in the real world. You've got the bios of our presenters, but there are 3 people I admire tremendously and look to for really the intellectual power of this field of youth development. Kristen Moore is, I believe, the founder?
Early.
Okay, she won't accept that. But she's a senior fellow at the Child Trends, which is just an incredible resource on so many things, but today increasingly on evidence-based practices and so many other things. She's such a great speaker and resource. Jean Roque-Partain is the Director of Research and Development for the Search Institute, which really gave the world the 40 developmental assets that are so critical to this whole notion of a whole child in his and her environment. And then Marita Irby, who is the COO and co-founder of the very wonderful Forum for Youth Investment, which most of you, I'm sure, have heard of it, and if you haven't, you should. Kind of known today by their major brand, which is called Ready by 21. And as we think about policy for kids, isn't that it? Ready for college, work, and life by Okay, around 21. Maybe 26, maybe 24. It really doesn't matter, but I love how that's framed, and I think Marita will be sharing with you really the concept of Ready by 21, which is to mobilize leaders and communities to make sure kids are ready by 21. The presenters are just going to go in order, and we turn it to Kristen first.
Thank you very much, Irvin. I'm delighted to be here. My goal is to talk about common ground. I'm going to talk about the research field, the child development field, the youth development field, and draw out some common tenets, some principles that have been produced through the decades of research, and share them with you to inform the larger discussion. I'm going to start out with a life course perspective. The notion that children move through time, that development does not stop at age 5, that what happens at one life cycle stage affects what happens later on, that toxic stress early in a child's life has implications for their school success, that their school success during the middle school years affects how they behave as teenagers and their college probabilities. The ecological perspective. This is just a bedrock and widely accepted perspective in the research field. The notion that we're taking the child as the center, and that beyond that are these concentric circles of influence on the child. The parents, peers, and teachers are the first circle. They're the most proximal, the closest to the child, and therefore they're the most important. Going back further from there, the PTA, community groups, churches, neighborhoods, are also important, but they're more distant. And research finds they're a little bit less central influences on children's development. Laws, policy, the media, and then societal and cultural norms, all part of children's environments, and all affect how they develop. But the more distant influences are indeed less important than the ones the parents, teachers, and peers. The whole child perspective, we've heard that phrase before. The notion, we hear a lot, I live in Washington, D.C., we hear a lot about the importance of education and accountability in the education field. The whole child perspective treats children as more than education entities. They're also, their health is important, their behavior is important, and their socio-emotional development is important. Not only that, they influence one another. A child who has health issues may not prosper in school in the same way that a child whose health issues have been addressed. And a child who's not doing well in school is more likely to act out and have behavior problems and become a teen parent, et cetera. So to treat a child not as these siloed ways, but as a whole child is very much part of the research view of child development. The interesting thing about the language, people use a lot of different terms to approach this, but we looked at it and we found that they actually sort pretty well into these categories: physical health, development and safety, psychological and emotional development, cognitive development, educational attainment, and social development and behavior. So again, there's a lot of common ground even when people are using somewhat different language. Another important distinction that researchers make is that between inputs, or what we researchers call independent variables, and outcomes, what we call the dependent variable. The notion being that inputs lead to outcomes, and inputs include forces like poverty, health coverage, schools, food security, and after-school programs. And then they affect the outcomes that I just talked about: education, health, behavior, and socio-emotional development. And it's really important to distinguish those things because we want to affect the inputs, if we can, to improve those outcomes. And oftentimes people talk about poverty as though it were a characteristic of a child, but it's not. It's an input. It's something that affects how children are, and many, if not most of these inputs are malleable. And we really need to focus on them and think about how they can affect outcomes in a holistic sense. Also want to focus on positive outcomes, not just the negative outcomes. In the domain of cognitive development and education, we often focus on negative outcomes like dropout, truancy, and expulsion, and certainly those are extremely important. Policymakers care a lot about them, taxpayers do. But you've heard already this morning about some of the more positive aspects like educational engagement, curiosity, and critical thinking. And it's pretty clear that from the point of view of children, students, they really care about the investments that are made in their, so that they can feel engaged in school, that they develop curiosity and that they develop critical thinking skills. From the point of view of a participant, it's really important to think about the positive. Moving on to psychological and emotional development, a lot of concern about depression, low self-esteem, and suicidal thoughts. But the research community would also hope that we focus on life satisfaction, hope, empathy, and other positive characteristics. In the domain of social behavior and development, lots of attention to drinking, drug use, gang involvement, and I certainly don't want to suggest that those are not important. They're very important. But oftentimes we neglect civic engagement, volunteering, and environmental stewardship, which are things that kids can do, and as we've seen, do and be effective at, and learn while they are doing them. In physical health development and safety, again, focus on illness, obesity, and injury. But we could be focusing on the positives, exercise, healthy eating habits, and safety habits, such as wearing a seatbelt or a helmet. So another outcome, it's sort of in between being an input and an outcome, is that of relationships. And I think that's another theme that has come from research as well as from the field. But relationships are really, really critical. And again, there's a lot of focus on conflict, violence, arguments. But the positive relationships that children have with parents, siblings, and with their friends. I mean, most of the influences of peers are positive, not negative. And so it's really important to focus on that, to measure it, and to use that in our programs. Turning next to measurement. Researchers care a lot about measurement, and the research community spent a lot of time developing measures, and the notion of providing them so that we could have comparable measures across our fields, that we could use comparable and rigorous high-quality measures in evaluation studies, in performance management, in our programs and organizations, that we could use them in our surveys, longitudinal surveys of educational and youth success, and that we could use them as indicators in order to monitor the well-being of America's children over time. And that way we would really have this reciprocal kind of an interaction that would improve all of our understanding and thereby improve outcomes for kids. Thank you.
Tag team.
Yes, my turn. It's great to be with you. I'm in an interesting place because I'm in an organization, Search Institute, that has a 50-year history of doing research on youth development. And a year ago, we assumed a new CEO with a background in college and career readiness, with a background in education. So I feel like we're dancing on that divide and that intersection of education and youth development. So this is delightful to be with you today and be part of this conversation. Search Institute is an applied social science research organization that focuses on discovering what kids need to succeed in their families, schools, and communities. So we've been working across the divide of community life for about 20 years, understanding the ecologies of development. So in some ways, what we've been trying to do is to operationalize in one framework a bit of what Kristen was talking about around the ecology of development, what kids need to succeed. So I just want to briefly introduce that and then talk about some of the new research that hasn't actually been published yet, connecting developmental assets and college and career readiness, and some educational stuff. So our core framework is what we call developmental assets. It's been mentioned a few times here. We created this framework about 23 years ago now, to begin to understand what are the factors that make a positive difference in kids' development. It actually came out of a conversation, I think a letter back then, back when we sent mail. We got a letter that basically said, why do we always just measure the bad stuff? And so we started to measure some of the good stuff that grew out of the field of resilience, prevention, education, all of these different things, and put them together in a framework, and it turned out to have power. And so we've been using that for a while and adapting and growing for a while. The developmental assets names a bit about the ecology of development as well as the individual traits of kids. The external assets are the supports that kids need in their lives around a sense of support, people who love them and care for them, places that they're cared for, a sense of empowerment, of contribution, civic engagement, participation, boundaries and expectations, a sense of challenge that some things are good to do, some things are not good to do, and that you have consistent messages about boundaries from your families and your school and your community and neighborhood. And then constructive use of time, which is the domain that after-school programs find their greatest home in, is how are you spending your time in arts, music, sports, religious activities, all of those kinds of things. So those are the kinds of opportunities, external opportunities and supports that kids need, some of them. We've named 20 of them. If you look at the whole framework, you could name 55 others. But people say 40 is too long already, so that's another whole message. So those are the kind of supports that we need. But there's also the strengths that kids need in themselves, that sense of agency, who I am, what do I bring to the party? So how are we developing a commitment to learning in our kids, that internal motivation, that intrinsic motivation? What are the values that we want them to have around integrity, honesty, restraint, those kinds of things? What are the kind of social competencies around planning and decision-making, getting along with others, resolving conflict peacefully? Somehow that's relevant this week in D.C., but we won't go there. And then positive identity, a sense of purpose, promise, and power in your own life, a sense of self-efficacy for making a difference. So 40 things, they're in a framework, you can find it on the web, and we put them together in a survey which we've now used in both cross-sectional and longitudinal research, have a data set of about 5 million kids, starting to use it internationally as well. So just to give you a sense of the big picture of why assets matter, what we find in all of the studies across hundreds of communities, thousands of communities, is the more of these developmental assets kids have in their lives, the better off they are. We see increased evidence of thriving correlationally and longitudinally around grades, around leadership, around delayed gratification. We see reduced risks around alcohol, violence, and other risk behaviors, and we see increased resilience of kids who are struggling when they have those assets in their lives because of other external issues like poverty or being in a family that's not as strong, that these assets can help compensate for that. And we're seeing this true across a range of backgrounds. It's true across economic differences. It's true for special education status. It's true for across racial ethnic groups. It's true in different kinds of family configurations. It's true across gender differences, and it's true across levels of English proficiency. So across all different kinds of populations of kids, we see these assets matter. They matter a little differently in different populations. We can get into a little bit more subtlety in that. But the reality is having a strong foundation of developmental strengths and supports matters for kids' outcomes. I just want to illustrate this with one study that we're just now finishing the analysis of. It's a total of 40,000 kids in one southwestern school district. We're focused on the sample of 9th to 12th graders. And about two-thirds of the sample is Latino, and the other majority is African American. And they're largely it's largely a poor district. So just to get a sense of the demographics of this particular sample. What we find in this, and we were able to measure developmental assets as well as and connect them to actual GPAs, PSAT scores, and some other school records. And what we find is that the assets and the categories of assets, the support, boundaries, all of that stuff, contributes significantly over time at levels we have here to PSAT scores and GPAs. And so when we look at the asset levels, for example, in 9th grade, and then look at their GPAs in 10th grade, controlling for other factors, we see a significant correlation. at 0.21, and then PSAT scores at 0.17. And that the strongest correlations are in the categories of commitment to learning, that makes sense, around achievement motivation, bonding to school, those kinds of things, and in social competencies, decision-making, planning, getting along with others, those kind of things. And what's interesting is we have some other measures out of Connolly's work of college readiness, and we find that the levels of these developmental assets actually contribute more than some of the things around test taking and other areas of competence. So it's not, by the way, it's not an either-or thing. The case we're trying to make here is that these things add value to the other conversations. So if that's your goal, there's something else to be added. So this is just the basic correlations between asset scores for each of the 8 categories and then the GPA a year later. So our takeaways are these non-cognitive, I'm using both, non-cognitive and social-emotional supports and strengths really do seem to have a key role in school success. And we've said that over and over and over today. This is reinforcing that message. And that there are community and family factors that play a role in educational success and college readiness. So from our perspective, the challenge is not to get after-school programs and families to look more like schools. It's to get families, after-school programs, neighbors to do what they do best around developing whole children, and recognize that complements what happens in schools. And so how do we put those pieces together? In our work, we're beginning to focus on how do you begin to work with families, schools, and communities to build the kind of developmental relationships that lead to those skills that ultimately lead to success in college, work, and life. So what kinds of relationships matter? There's a growing body of research highlighting relationships as the active ingredient for effective programs. And so how do we begin to understand what a relationship between a teacher and a student looks like that really helps the kid grow? What is a relationship between a youth worker, a coach, a mentor, a volunteer, and a student? What are those dimensions that help that grow? What's a relationship? What do parents do that really helps kids grow and learn from a relational perspective? At a simple level, it's that combination of support, I care about you, I love you, I'll do anything for you, and challenge. You can do better, you can grow. There's things you want to do, let's help you do it. And so that's our work, and we think there's a lot to be said about college work and life working together, and turn it over to Marita to talk about how they're beginning to operationalize that in the real world. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if you all saw me kind of limping in earlier, but I'm going to sit. I had that wonderful experience this week of, I would like to say it was a sports injury, but really I kind of stood up and was trying to get something off the printer, and my knee just didn't want to go that way. So I will sit, if that's all right with y'all. And I just wanted to pick up on what you're saying on kind of the operationalizing in the real world, because when Irv was introducing us, he sort of said, they're kind of think tanks or sort of action tanks. And I think we're up here sort of a research committee, but in all of our work, it really is about working out with people in places that are trying to make a difference for kids. And so it's how do you bring this research and how do you bring what we're measuring really front and center into the conversations, because what we know is what gets measured actually is what gets done. It's what people focus on. So the couple of things that I wanted to pop up are really about how we're doing work with communities, and maybe it's getting a little bit to your question, Ronnie, of the nuts and bolts of these community partnerships and how do you put these things into action. A lot of the work that we've done at the forum over the last decade has really been working with school community partnerships, cradle to career partnerships. If you pick up on the collective impact language that's out there now, it really is how do you bring a range of players in the community to bear on the change that you want to see happen. So it's sort of that whole community, whole child, whole community approach to this work. And I just want to share a few of the kind of both the visuals and some of the research that we use to really make the case for why this work is important, how to be able to bring people together around it, and then what are some of the things people are really practically doing to be able to measure that. So one of the key things that we just lead with and focus on, and this is sort of an expansion on what Kristen was showing you with the inputs and the outcomes picture. Ultimately, we are focusing on child and youth outcomes, that big gear, but what you need to have in place in terms of family, school, and community supports, the inputs, that she was talking about, critically important. But the piece that we are focusing on increasingly is that small gear of the leaders in communities and how they're coming together. And this is leaders broadly defined. I think as you were also hearing from Michael this morning, it's young people are leaders as well as are part of this work, not just in the programs or in the direct delivery, but also in the decision making. How are you engaging the range of leaders in communities to really be actively involved? What we know from the research, though, is it takes a while to turn those gears. It takes kind of 7 to 10 years to really turn the dial in terms of some of those broader outcomes. But we can make a difference much sooner, more like in the 3 to 5, in terms of what's happening in the family, school, community, and supports. In your community action and how you make this happen in your partnerships, sometimes that just feels a little bit too far out. Being able to say, well, what can we be doing right now as leaders? How do we build our capacity? What does good look like there? How can we change that in 1 to 2 years? And how do we know that actually how we're doing good coming together around this, good community partnerships in this work actually does make a difference in how you're able to turn that middle gear and turn the outcomes gear. Good quality standards in terms of that work actually makes a difference further down the line when you're talking about making a difference for young people. So what we wanted to take a quick look at, and I'm just going to pop up and refer you to this, back to this piece that y'all were looking at earlier, in terms of the shared vision and the learning, working, thriving, connecting, leading that Irv was talking about. In short form, when we're out doing this work with communities and community leaders and saying, well, what is it that you really care about in terms of child and youth outcomes, putting it into that broader frame, which you see going across the top of the page in the centerpiece of the research committee's work, is that productive, connected, healthy, and safe, right? But why we put it in a bullseye in terms of being able to make some of the arguments around this is we are very focused on the academic and vocational productivity, especially in this country. That's we want kids to do well in school. We want them to succeed in college. We want them to be able to enter into the workforce, really being able to make a difference. We also tend to focus a great deal on the physical health and safety. And this is where when Kristen we were looking at some of those indicators, we can get our hands on the data of the things we want to prevent happening, right? We can get our hands on all the risk behaviors and dropout and pregnancy and the health risk behaviors, all these things. We can get our hands on that information, but the piece that's often missing is that middle ring on the social and civically connected. It's harder to get our hands on that data information, but it's also the thing that we know makes a difference in the middle of the bullseye in terms of academics, but it also makes a difference in terms of being able to avoid those risky behaviors and develop those positive health habits. So even being able to put it up there and say, we really should be caring about that whole picture because they relate to each other. All those pieces make a difference. And then as we're measuring in that, exactly what Kristen was saying of you need to have a balanced set of what you're looking at, that it's not just things you're trying to prevent, but it's also what you're trying to promote in terms of the development of young people. So we start with that. The next couple of slides I was going to just pop up quickly is sort of how we kind of make the case for some of this and use some of those other kind of key constituents and communities to be able to say this is really important. So this from the National Governors Association, this is from a few years back, but really talking about what those skills are that we need to be able to compete for young people in a global economy, is really about being able to attain those competencies and attributes that are necessary to really contribute to the economic growth in our community. So those kind of long-term, so what does it make for difference for us in our community? What we know, this is data from just the last year, I think probably, how many of you have seen this point from the military? 75% of young Americans ages 17 to 24 are unable to join the military, primarily because they're poorly educated, physically unfit, or involved in crime. And so from a different sort of set of actors, the preparedness question definitely gets put on the table in terms of we're just not preparing the next generation for key roles in society, that being one. This is from research a few years back from corporate Voices for Working Families, where they were doing a survey of employers and asking them what they were really looking for in terms of folks coming into the workplace. And they basically said 4 out of 10 high school graduates really don't have some of the key skills that they want to have in terms of critical thinking, communication skills, all these kinds of things to be able to come into the workforce. They're basically saying that we are using the college diploma, not the high school diploma, for the entry requirement before we'll even look at a resume. And even in those cases, what they were saying, they found only 1 in 4 college graduates really highly qualified for the kinds of positions that they had open and available. So there's a huge kind of retraining aspect to this in workforce development for folks coming into the workplace. How's it getting measured in places? It's not just around measurements in kind of the broader community. Things like the 40 assets and other things are really helping to fill in that picture for folks. But there's also, how are we measuring this in schools? This is just a piece from the New Tech Highs, New Tech Network, I guess it is now, because it's in almost half the states, I think, in the country. There are some schools that are using this, that are trying to bring into the actual kind of grading and report system in schools some of these other skills, content, not just content literacy, but communications, oral communications, collaboration, work ethic, critical thinking, that we're trying to say, again, how do you operationalize this? And what gets measured is what gets focused on, is what gets done. Just a couple of other things. If that's whole child, who are you bringing together around that work? And this is really getting us into more the preparation for college, preparation for workforce, when you look at this whole continuum. So it's a little hard to see here. Sorry for that in terms of the lighting, but if you think about that education pipeline, and this for our work with communities increasingly are focusing on not just the P20 councils, sort of preschool through college, but really looking at more of a cradle to career kinds of efforts and thinking that education is a key part of it, but what is the range of community actors that are being able to provide those kinds of developmental supports on up through the age continuum. So the kinds of enriching environments that we've been talking about today, and making sure that we're focusing on those outcomes, but that all the places where young people spend their time are really providing those kinds of inputs that Kristen was talking about that make effective learning and engagement and development possible. I think I'm going to wrap with just that. Does it make a difference if they get those inputs? Does it really make a difference? Can we make a difference in this picture? Michelle Gambone, Jim Connell, and some others did some research a few years back to really look at that connection between basically the inputs and the outcomes. And we're looking at what was readiness, how would you define it, and how many young people really were doing well. And just like those slides we were looking at earlier, pretty much no matter how you slice it, and looking at the data, about 4 in 10 are doing well, about 2 in 10 are really not doing that well. When they looked at this, they were putting the thresholds pretty low. 4 in 10 was, by the time you were getting into early 20s, young adulthood, that productivity, you were attending, college, or you had a job, you had good health habits, you were being connected in some way, which is sort of once a month you did some kind of volunteer activity or went to a faith organization, that kind of thing. But 2 in 10 doing poorly was basically things like you were committing an illegal activity once a month, or things along those lines. They sort of tried to look at all the longitudinal data of lots of different data sets, and what they found was, you actually could make a difference in that picture. If you're getting if you're getting the key supports that we've been talking about, it does make a difference. Looking just at one of them, like caring adults, you actually had, I don't think I had that one other, but just looking at things like caring adults, you could actually go from for young people entering into high school, by the time they came out and were going into young adulthood, you went from basically 3 in 10 being ready to more 7 in 10 being ready in young adulthood for just controlling on that one piece of caring adults. So it really does make a difference in terms of the long term. The overall picture, if you had all of those kinds of supports that you needed, you really could make a shift like this, from 4 in 10 doing well to 7 in 10 doing well, from 2 in 10 doing poorly to 1 in 10 doing poorly. We know what it takes to make a difference. It's, are we really doing what we need to do to make sure that all young people are getting those critical supports? I'm going to stop there because I see that look.
Once again, I think you've seen over the course of the day how this builds. It is all about success, but there are stepping stones, both positive and negative, to accomplishing success. Most importantly, we have to make sure that we secure those pathways for these youth. I want to take a couple of questions. We've just got a couple of minutes. Right there, you're going to have to, I'll listen loud, how's that?
Salem Valentino, I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation with the Red Cross Sisters of America. And listening to you, Jean, you talked about the complementary relationship, the schools, community leaders, and I feel like we can engage in these talks at a national level, and we're very comfortable with that. And then our local agencies are constantly reaching out to me, and they're not being invited to the table, and they're having a hard time talking about some of these other outcomes that we recognize in the research as being valuable, but locally it's not recognized unless we're talking about grades or truancy or these like much more hard indicators of academic success. So I guess I'm just wondering if you all have any advice for what they could be saying. I mean, I give them my own advice, but I'm hoping they all have some other recommendations. How do you make change?
Do you want to start, Jean, or you want me?
You go ahead, I'll think of something.
No, it's interesting. We run into this a lot in just really practically. A lot of communities are looking at sort of these cradle-to-career partnerships and focusing on the education pipeline, and we often hear from youth-serving organizations or other folks that are more focused in terms of community settings saying, but we focus on these other set of outcomes that don't necessarily hit the top of the list. If we're looking at third grade reading, high school graduation, and a couple of key indicators, because people just want to pick 2 or 3 things to focus on, how do ours become seen as part of the picture? And there's a couple of things that in the coaching and the work that we do that we help folks do. One is being able to really, through research that others have done, be able to say, well, wait a second, if that's really what you want to make a difference in, if that's the middle of the bullseye that you care about, to be able to make a difference in that, these other things connect. They're critically important to be able to get the academic outcomes that you care about and being able to give them the things to be able to make that argument. And then the other is really much like what the kind of piece that's laid out here is being able to say, so then what could those things that we are really focusing on, how do we get them to be a part of the picture? How do we help broaden that lens a little bit and be able to have not just the research arguments, but sort of at our fingertips what we can get our hands on in this community in terms of data and information to be able to fill out that picture. So being able to sort of make the case in a way that it hits the bottom line of the key leaders that already sort of picked the couple things we're going to focus on, and then being able to show the relationship and say, we're critical actors that can help you achieve that outcome, but we're going to put all that effort in there, why not also address these at the same time? And we have some tools and resources to help people have those conversations, which we can link you to and be able to give you some examples of how people have tackled that challenge.
Hi. I think my response would be somewhat similar, and we have the bedrock research that would demonstrate that this is the way to go, but I think we need evaluation that shows that it is really effective in achieving the outcomes that policymakers and funders care about. We've been doing some work lately with integrated student services, the community schools, and we do find that they're very much based in what basic research on child development would say a school might be doing, dealing with the whole child over time. But there is only an emerging evidence base, and I think really we need to do evaluations that look at the critical negative and positive outcomes.
Just to add 3 things maybe. One, I think the time is right with things like Paul Tuff's book being out there from an education perspective, talking about the stuff that matters in out-of-school time and other settings. So I think there is some foment going on around right now, so it may be different than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. So that would be one piece. I think we're all trying to figure out how to build models that you can then point to. So we're, how do we work with a community to integrate into their cradle-to-career measurement non-cognitive or social-emotional factors or whatever. And I'm using non-cognitive because that's what folks in education are using. So let's try to write it for a little bit and get in. The other thing I would say is what I would not want the non-school time to do is to try to be like schools. And that is a risk of let's try to do what the schools want, what the schools do best. We're going to try to do that too, and I'm not sure that's our strength. And so I would push back against sort of let's make sure all we do is tutoring or all we do is this, that, or the other, which are fine, but our volunteers don't have the expertise in how do you do literacy work with a particular age of child. That's what Yeah, so that would be the other piece, is not to sort of get co-opted, but to play to the strength of families and communities to complement what happens at schools.
Last question, Ronnie, you had your hand up?
I need to get you this for the live streaming.
Yes. I love all the work, and Gamboni's work in the early 2000s was very relevant when I was trying to build, working with Congressman Major Owens in Brooklyn, a TEC, Technology to Empower Community, and tried to bring the different organizations and community-based groups together around mobilizing around technology centers and tools that would focus on empowering the entire community. Anyway, we made tremendous headway. I opened 11 technology centers and marshaled all kinds of grants and things, $6 million, to really make a difference. But I discovered in 2002 or 2001 Gamboni's research, which was the only research I knew that was looking at the community model. Then I discovered your work with Karen Pittman, but in the meantime I was off doing other things, and so I never acted on it. I don't have an answer, but the question is, I think, and this is not to undermine any research, research is so significant, but Congresspeople, and I spent 13 years on the Hill, would walk around with under their arms the rising tide and stuff, and nothing happened. The question is, what do we do that's going to be disseminated visually on television, whatever, that mobilizes? We need policymakers and community leaders to utilize the frameworks and do something and help shift the paradigms and the thinking to understand the frameworks that you all have developed that is so critical and powerful. But I think we need to think out of the box, and how are we going to shift the national frameworks, the national discourse, to shift the paradigms in thinking and value the frameworks in your experiences.
Who wants to take the lead on a response?
Maybe a quick one. We find a lot of our work is at the state and local level because we actually find movement happening there. People, the closer you get to the kid, the easier it is to say, you're talking about the whole kid. And so how do you take a whole child, kind of whole community approach to this work? One of the things that we have been long with the CLAB and the partners here kind of advocating for at the federal level is as you're doing your funding and as you're putting out programs and all this kind of thing, how do you help address the kind of proliferation of partnerships at the local level? Because you get this kind of thing of I pick a problem, I create a funding stream, people have the whole village kind of approach, like I know I need the whole village, but to come around one issue at a time, and you end up with having 30 different local partnerships with 80% overlap in terms of who's coming to the table at that kind of thing. And so one of the things we're really talking about and having been promoting at the federal level is it's not don't stop collaborating, just stop creating new collaboratives. Can you even write into things like this? If you want to take a whole child approach and a whole community approach, which conceptually people kind of get, then think about that as you're putting things out to support communities, so you're not requiring them to create a new table each time, but look around for the existing tables and how to connect and build on those.
Community mapping.
And mapping the coalitions and networks, it's part of what we help places do, because you're trying to get more energy, not dissipate the energy by having so many different collections of people doing work.
Kristen?
I'll just add, I would argue that it's as much about collaborations of programs but also citizen engagement and action.
Yep.
And so how do we move beyond saying, let's get our programs to lobby for more money for their programs, which, by the way, I support, for those of you in the room, but how do we engage every parent, every teacher, every neighbor, every grandparent is recognizing their role in kids' success?
Yeah.
Okay,
I would
we're
add
about
just
to
one more
take-
thing, which
Go
is to give it time.
Sorry, Kristen.
That doesn't happen in a minute.
Speaking of minutes. As a segue.
Well done.
We're going to take our last break. And what I want to focus on particularly as we come back is The next session is really a culmination of everything we've been talking about today. Come back with vigor. You're going to hear from Ann Coles talking not only about college access but success, and they don't always come in the same box. Quick break. We'll see you back here.